Hey there, everyone. So obviously we are going to try something a little bit new today. Usually this is the sort of thing that we would have a class discussion about, but since that's not going to happen anytime soon, I made this little video that will hopefully explain some of the super important and iconic symbolism of To Kill a Mockingbird. So for today, you were supposed to read chapters 10 and 11, but let's start with chapter 10. When it comes to symbolism and important things that should tell you a lot about the rest of the book, chapter 10 really should have flashing lights around it. It's the first chapter in which we really see the idea of the mockingbird introduced. Hopefully you noticed that when Jem and Scout get their air rifles, pretty much the only restrictions Atticus gives them is to, one, don't point them at people, and two, he tells them that it is a sin to kill a mockingbird. Miss Maudie goes on to say that mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for us to enjoy. They don't eat up people's gardens, don't nest in corn cribs. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. Scout continues that she had never heard Atticus call anything else a sin ever. And this should be a red flag to the reader to pay attention to how they're talking about mockingbirds. Also, since the title of the book is To Kill a Mockingbird, you should also feel like Harper Lee is hitting you in the face to pay attention to how she is using mockingbirds as a symbol. Remember when we talked about the old man in the sea and how lions were being used as a symbol for strength, youth, power, that sort of thing? Mockingbirds, based on their own innate characteristics and how they act as birds in a literal sense, how they sing and interact with the world around them, have also become a symbol in literature, like the lions. We've already heard Miss Maudie's explanation of mockingbirds, but let's take another look together. So a mockingbird is a gentle bird that only lives to sing. They're utterly non-destructive. They live to create beautiful sounds, and it's a sin to kill them because they are totally innocent and have done no wrong. Even so, mockingbirds may still be a target for sport, like shooting, which is what Atticus explicitly tells Jem never to do. I want you to turn to page 23 in your To Kill a Mockingbird study packets. Pause the video if you need to go find it, which I'm guessing most of you probably do. I'm assuming you just found it. So the first three questions on page 23 ask for you to consider what the mockingbird might symbolize. We know that mockingbirds symbolize innocence in a big sense, but we're looking at specifically in this book who might embody that symbol of innocence of the mockingbird. This means what characters are innocent, trying to bring more kindness and beauty into the world, while perhaps maybe they're also being cruelly targeted. If we were in person, I'd have you guys come up with a list of potential mockingbird candidates. Since we're not, I'm going to ask you to look at how Atticus, Tom Robinson, and Boo Radley might in some way be a mockingbird. Take Atticus's words from chapter 3. He says, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." So try to walk around in the skin of various characters. Really try to consider things from their perspective. Watch out especially for prejudice, which is that prejudgment based on a personal bias, and maybe how that prejudice might make other characters act towards these guys. Also look out for how your own prejudice might affect how you view Atticus, Tom, and Boo. Be careful not to assume that someone is the way you see them currently. Pay attention to context and how people act at home, in their community, or in the courthouse, because it might not be the same in all circumstances. All right, that was a lot about the mockingbird, but there's another important symbol in chapter 10. On page 23 of your packet, it also asks about Tim Johnson. For those of you who might have been a little confused, Tim Johnson is the mad dog that Atticus shoots in chapter 10. So Tim Johnson is certainly a mad dog, and his interaction with Atticus shows us a lot about Atticus's character. But also, there's a lot more going on, and I want you to pay attention to the contrasts here. So Atticus tells Jem that it is a sin to kill a mockingbird because mockingbirds are innocent and do no harm. In contrast to that, Atticus shoots Tim Johnson because Tim Johnson is a rabid dog who puts the entire community at risk. We should look at Tim Johnson, the dog, as a sort of counter symbol to the mockingbird. Mockingbirds are harmless, though they might be fun to shoot. Tim Johnson is an incredibly dangerous dog, though Scout tells the reader that he doesn't look dangerous. He doesn't appear dangerous at that time if you just look at him, but they know he is. So since we have two symbols that are being treated in very different ways, we have to ask, what is the main conflict of our story? Once again, I'm going to go back to when we did binary oppositions with our short story unit. We talked about things like age versus youth, Billy versus the landlady, light versus dark, illusion versus reality, things like that, where you have two opposite things in tension with each other. And we looked at how those can show us more about the main themes and conflicts of our story. So in this book, we're seeing a conflict between the mockingbird versus Tim Johnson, this rabid dog. So if we know that the mockingbird is a symbol for innocence, then we should also assume that Tim Johnson is probably symbolizing something. And there are a few options for what he might symbolize. The most obvious is probably racism or evil in general. Specifically, in this book, we are beginning to see an intensifying conflict between Atticus's moral decision to defend a Black man in court and the intense racial prejudice in Macomb County. In the town, they haven't even begun asking whether or not Tom Robinson is guilty. In fact, we don't even know what his supposed crime is yet. But the people in the town are very concerned with the fact that Atticus would step out of his white lane to defend a Black man, regardless of Tom Robinson's innocence or guilt. A few more notes on racism. If we look at Tim Johnson, this dog, as a symbol of racism, we also see a few things. So Scout says that the dog doesn't look dangerous. Racial prejudice and dehumanization in general, like what we've talked about before in our Holocaust unit, dehumanization and racial prejudice often doesn't look dangerous until it's gone way too far. Also, Atticus, who doesn't like using guns and frequently advises Jem and Scout to kind, gentle behavior, recognizes an intense danger in this mad dog. And Atticus puts aside his personal preferences and his own comfort to do something very difficult that needed to be done to protect others. He shoots the dog, and in the process, he loses his glasses, which might not seem like a big deal, but glasses were a lot more work to come by during that period in history. So he's sacrificing things that are important to himself in order to protect others. He sets aside himself to stop something that could potentially destroy the entire community by spreading a deadly disease. Therefore, we see that one of our central conflicts ends up being innocence versus racism. And it might be helpful to look at a few other angles of that as well in the future, such as innocence versus prejudice or innocence versus age, but we'll talk about that some other time. That's all for chapter 10, but in chapter 11, I just want to briefly, ever so briefly, draw your attention to the idea of courage. We've already seen this idea come up a few times in Atticus's conversations with others, him talking about courage and perseverance. In chapter 9, Atticus tells Scout that he is certain that he is not going to win his court case between Tom Robinson and the Ewells. And Scout asks him why he bothers fighting. Simply because we were licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us not to try to win. While I'm sure that his words seem crazy to some of you, I encourage you to consider how his choice to defend Tom Robinson shows courage, especially considering that he very much expects to lose. Similarly, in chapter 11, Mrs. DeBose displays what Atticus calls real courage. So despite the fact that there is no way for Mrs. DeBose to live longer by conquering her morphine addiction, side note, morphine is a drug that helps with pain, but it's also very addictive. But she chooses to get free of this addiction before her death. And Atticus tells Jem, I wanted you to see something about her. I wanted you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. So Atticus is once again challenging his children to walk around in someone else's skin and to see the strength and goodness in their character, to see their courage that might not be as obvious as some of their more annoying attributes. So that's all for chapters 10 through 11. But as you keep reading, really consider this quote from Atticus on page 33 and really try to consider things from different characters' perspectives. Do your best to try to empathize with them, look at things from their point of view. If you get confused by any of this symbolism stuff, try rewatching the video or leave me a question in the comments or send me a quick email. But good work today, you guys. Hang in there.